Hello, thank you for joining us today for the London Live lecture, Living Dangerously in Bloomsbury. We're very excited for everyone to be here. It looks like some people are still joining and will continue to join, so we're just going to give them one more minute. So just hang tight, grab some water if you need it, and we'll start soon. Perfect. All right, it looks like most people have joined now. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us today for the London Live lecture, Living Dangerously in Bloomsbury with Dr. Karina Jakubowicz. We're very excited for this lecture and we're so glad to see so many familiar faces and names, and we can't wait for today's event. So thank you for being here. We do want to leave a little bit of time at the end if possible for questions. So if throughout the lecture you have any questions that you think of, you can just put them in the chat and then we'll go through some of them at the end. So first off, I want to pass it over to FSU London Senior Associate Director, Dr. Lisa Bowers-Isaacson, to introduce our speaker today.
Hello, I want to introduce Karina. She is an academic delight. Her BA in English Lit is from Trinity College, Dublin. She has an MPhil in American Literature from Cambridge and a PhD in 20th Century Literature from University College, London. And there we can see her flowering interest in the Bloomsbury Group as she wrote on gardens and the work of Virginia Woolf. She has taught for FSU London since 2018. Freshmen taking her research genre and context praise Karina for the awesome feedback that she gives on their writing. And we haven't been shy to make use of her talents in the classroom because she's also teaching for us Intro to Shakespeare, Women in Lit, British authors. In 2017, Karina was awarded the Katherine Mansfield Essay Prize, and she has published articles, books, and podcasts on Virginia Woolf, the Bloomsbury Group, and the gender of gardens. Karina is also a screenwriter. A short film called Exit to Stage about an actress losing her grip on reality had its UK release in 2019. So Karina has been examining for many years now the literary life on the edge, and is just the person to talk to us now about living dangerously in Bloomsbury.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa, for that impressive introduction. I forgot I did half of those things, including the short film. Let me pull up my PowerPoint for you here today so that you've got it in front of you. We're hoping that this all goes smoothly and that there are no hiccups, you know, how online lectures can be. Keep our fingers crossed. We are living dangerously today on the edge, hoping that our internet holds fast. And that's essentially the theme of this lecture today, the Bloomsbury Group and their ways of living, their domestic experiments. When Virginia Woolf moved to Bloomsbury in 1904, she was struck by a powerful sense of opportunity. She wrote, "When one sees it today, Gordon Square is not one of the most romantic of the Bloomsbury squares. It has neither the distinction of Fitzroy Square nor the majesty of Mecklenburgh Square. It is prosperous, middle class, and thoroughly mid-Victorian. But I can assure you that in October 1904, it was the most beautiful, the most exciting, the most romantic place in the world. It was romantic because she was moving there to Gordon Square. That was the location of her first room of one's own, if you like." Woolf's move to Gordon Square would prove to be a defining moment in literary history, since it was there that she, along with her sister Vanessa and brothers Adrian and Toby, began holding the Thursday evening parties that led to the forming of what is now known as the Bloomsbury Group. Along with an imposing collective of individuals, intellectuals as well, writers and artists, Woolf redefined what it meant to live and love and think well. Now, the group weren't always harmonious, nor were their friendships or relationships always successful. But they were unflinchingly bold when it came to living and thinking for themselves, living according to their own views of the world. I often think of the Bloomsbury Group in relation to our FSU students who deliberately move to a new country in order to learn and live more creatively. At the heart of the study abroad ethos is the theory that being challenged by new places and by new ways of living in turn prompts us to create new intellectual spaces. So throughout this lecture, I want to discuss how the Bloomsbury Group lived and how in turn that fed into their philosophies and their work. Above all, I really want to emphasize this concept of living dangerously. How did they break from the norm? To what degree can we say what they were doing was dangerous or otherwise? We're going to go through chronologically, starting off with Cambridge University, the roots of the group, then going to Bloomsbury itself, and then moving beyond Bloomsbury, thinking about what happens after Gordon Square. But before we get really stuck into that history, as it were, we need to look at the group. And this is not a perfect art now. When we talk about the Bloomsbury Group, this is a nebulous mass of people. You know, we talk about Vita Sackville-West as belonging to the Bloomsbury Group. You know, she was a gardener, an aristocrat. She didn't really get on with them, though. I mean, she got on very well with Virginia Woolf, but a lot of the time she felt she didn't belong. Nonetheless, she has been kind of tethered to the lineage of the group itself. But these members that I've got in front of you here are definitely, if you like, the original set. Members we can say are absolutely part of the Bloomsbury Group. We've got Leonard Woolf, first of all, husband of Virginia. He's a publisher, a writer, and political theorist. Woolf was a pacifist and an anti-imperialist. He helped to write the reports that served as the basis for the founding of the League of Nations, really important historical character. We've then got Vanessa Bell, sister of Virginia Woolf, married to the art critic Clive Bell, who's also on this picture. She was a painter. I've got some of her paintings here in front of you, a post-impressionist painter. We have Virginia Woolf, my personal favourite, author of novels, short stories and essays. Her works included Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse and The Waves. We then have Clive Bell, an art critic and pacifist. Maynard Keynes, an economist. He develops what is now known as Keynesian economics, a form of economics that's designed to help communities recover from depression. We have E.M. Forster, novelist who published Howard's End and Passage to India. There's Toby Stephen, brother of Vanessa and Virginia and Adrian Stephen. He is one of the driving forces behind the Bloomsbury Group being formed. He's an amazing, smart, intellectual figure, but he really doesn't live long enough to see the fruits of his success. He dies relatively young in 1906 of typhoid. There's Roger Fry, an art critic. He's responsible for bringing the concept of post-impressionism to the British public consciousness. He introduces them to the work of Van Gogh and Matisse. Then we have Duncan Grant, artist. I'll show you some of his paintings. They're very nice. Here we are. Again, post-impressionist. And we have Lytton Strachey, a witty biographer. He writes these kind of slightly mocking, satirical biographies of Queen Victoria and Florence Nightingale. All these eminent Victorians. So all the members that I just mentioned there, and there are plenty more that I could go into, but just the ones that I've already listed, are united by their fierce intelligence. Those who have been to university, have gone to Cambridge, They've studied, they've won scholarships to go to Cambridge in many cases. They're also eccentric, they're misfits, and they have unpopular political opinions. When Clive Bell writes a pamphlet denouncing World War I, he's nearly arrested and all the copies are burnt. Lytton Strachey is brought up in front of law courts for refusing the draft. Clive Bell and Duncan Grant are likewise called to the front, but they refuse to serve. Many members of the group, famously perhaps as one of their great legacies, are homosexual. Woolf had a relationship with Vita Sackville-West. Maynard Keynes is a gay man. He spends most of his life not in relationships with men, but eventually as he gets older, he does form a lasting relationship. Maynard Keynes is also married, strangely, to a woman, the Russian ballerina Lydia Lobakova. E.M. Forster, likewise homosexual. Duncan Grant had one relationship with a woman, and that woman was Vanessa Bell. You can see in front of you here. But otherwise, he had relationships with men, one of whom was his own cousin, Lytton Strachey. And Lytton was, amongst his friends, perhaps the most openly homosexual and openly camp person within the group. He had numerous doomed love affairs with men. He was always having these sustained crushes that never came to anything. Now, this, of course, is a period when homosexuality is illegal. It led to a hard labour prison sentence if you were convicted. And the members of the Bloomsbury Group were highly aware of this, not least of all because in 1895, the illustrious playwright Oscar Wilde had been imprisoned in Reading Jail on a charge of public indecency. This was partly as a result of his sexual and romantic relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas. So already we can see that some of these people are prepared to live dangerously, to live boldly, illegally, before they even enter Bloomsbury. Their political opinions, their personal affections, all of this could prove disastrous in conventional London society and indeed in society at large. So they're naturally, if you like, risky people. While the social networks within the Bloomsbury Group blossom in Gordon Square, the same cannot be said of the group's ideas, which were forged in the crucible of Cambridge University in the early 20th century. In 1899, Lytton Strachey, Sidney Saxon Turner, Toby Stephen and Clive Bell entered Trinity College, Cambridge. These guys are going to be kind of the seeds of the Bloomsbury that comes after. While at the university, these voraciously intelligent and eccentric students were drawn to other men like themselves, such as the future novelist E.M. Forster and the economist John Maynard Keynes. In 1902, Strachey, Saxon Turner and Woolf were all invited to the secretive Cambridge Conversazione Society. It was also known as the Cambridge Apostles. Now, this was a great honour since only 3 new members were added each year. Potential new members were actually scouted out without them knowing. And while they were being sort of judged from a distance, their wit and their conversation would be carefully studied. A potential candidate didn't know that he was proposed until he was actually accepted. And at his initiation, he would be briefed on the society's history and traditions. He would sign the book, that was its name, just the book, which was a kind of leather-bound diary. And he would also swear a curse or a vow of secrecy to keep everything, in the society a secret and to keep the society itself a secret. It's quite Masonic in many ways. Woolf, Strachey and Toby Stephen had already formed a small society of their own on joining Cambridge. It was called the Midnight Society. But the apostles offered something more. The apostles offered the opportunity to be immersed in an even more challenging intellectual environment with a far more prestigious history. It was also, despite the name, a chance to enter into open philosophical debate beyond a strictly theological framework. Cambridge at this point in history is no longer a university that premised its philosophical thinking on theological debate. It was instead a space where students were increasingly encouraged to consider moral philosophy and ethics, and to take that beyond a strictly religious framework. The passing of the Universities Tests Act in 1871 allowed Roman Catholics and non-Christians to take up professorships and fellowships. And it also banned religious texts for all students except those studying divinity. So suddenly, the intellectual atmosphere in Cambridge isn't rooted to this idea of biblical study, of exegesis. Now we've got an open framework, a kind of broader philosophical landscape within which to work. And we can see this kind of the way that it played a role in the debates held by the apostles. I've got here a lovely list of names. I mean, you may have to squint if your screen is small, but this is a page with all the signatures, the membership list with Maynard Keynes as vice president. You can see Leonard Woolf here, Lytton Strachey as well. And here, this is what I wanted to get to. Here we have an example of one of the debates that they held. Not religious at all, not Christian, not even really moral. The question is, why laugh? Why indeed? Responses include, because you want to. Someone's written, why not? Someone else has said, why indeed? Lytton Strachey says, don't. So it's tongue-in-cheek, it's quite fun. And I think this gives us a taste of the conversations that were to follow in Gordon Square at those famous Thursday evening parties where the Bloomsbury Group started to solidify. When G.E. Moore's philosophical treatise Principia Ethica was published in 1903, it provided exactly the kind of secular work that they needed upon which to kind of base these broad discussions about life and art. Indeed, it had such a dramatic impact on these young Cambridge men that it was later dubbed the Bloomsbury Bible. Moore's work emphasised states of mind, the importance of pleasure, and the role of beauty in everyday life. In Principia Ethica, he gives his readers license to become absorbed in beauty and in the inherent goodness of nature and art. A little sample here for you. He writes, by far the most valuable things which we can know or imagine are certain states of consciousness, which may be roughly described as the pleasures of human intercourse, the enjoyment of beautiful objects. No one probably who has asked himself the question has ever doubted that personal affection and the appreciation of what is beautiful in art or nature are good in themselves, nor if we consider what things are worth having purely for their own sakes. When Moore described the pleasures of human intercourse, he meant conversation, but it's possible to see how the ambiguity of the phrasing might have appealed to many of these Cambridge students whose attraction to one another was not always platonic. Lytton Strachey described himself as being carried away by the book, declaring the year of its publication to mark the beginning of the age of reason. So we can see the peculiar community engendered by a Cambridge college as the blueprint for life at 46 Gordon Square. When Toby moved there with his brother Adrian and his two sisters, he recreated some of that atmosphere. He invites his old friends Lytton Strachey and Saxon Turner to the Thursday evening parties, And these evenings are going to be dominated by intellectual debate, by open discussion, by consideration of what is beauty, what is art. Toby's Bloomsbury began at Cambridge, but for his sisters, Vanessa and Virginia, the story began in their childhood home at Hyde Park Gate in West London. Now, some of you who may have been on the study abroad course or have visited London will know the area of Kensington. Think Hyde Park and you're there. And I've done a lovely orange blob to show you where Virginia Woolf's childhood home is located, just off the map there. Virginia remembers Hyde Park Gate in her memoirs, which were published much later after her death in the 1970s. They were published as a text called Moments of Being, if you're interested in it. And in a chapter of this work titled Old Bloomsbury, she tries to explain the founding of the Bloomsbury Group. And she says, in order to understand what that was about, you have to first go through Hyde Park Gate. She says, it is the house I would like you to imagine for a moment. For though Hyde Park Gate seems now so distant from Bloomsbury, its shadow falls across it. 46 Gordon Square could never have meant what it did had not 22 Hyde Park Gate preceded it. This is the house, it still stands. It has many, many blue plaques on it. You can see Vanessa Bell and Virginia Woolf are remembered along with their father, Leslie Stephen. So Hyde Park Gate is being given to us here, a metaphorical gateway that takes us through to Gordon Square and its subsequent associations with modernity and a bold new age. Now, Hyde Park Gate was a typically Victorian home. Virginia's parents were well-known figures in 19th century society. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was an eminent essayist and biographer who had once been married to the daughter of the novelist William Makepeace Thackeray. Woolf's mother, Julia, had also known the Thackeray's. That's how she met Leslie. And she was a celebrated beauty in her day. She'd been painted by the pre-Raphaelites in her youth and sat for her aunt, the renowned photographer, Juliet Margaret Cameron. While her brothers, Woolf's brothers, had been immersed in the camaraderie afforded by the university system, Virginia was an impressive influence of her father and half-brothers. She wasn't sent to school. Most of what she learned, she gleaned from her father's library. Hyde Park Gate was a house into which Stevens and Thackeray's, because Leslie has a daughter from his first marriage, and Duckworths, who were that's the children from Julia's first marriage, are all crammed together in one space. That's 11 people in total, waited on by 7 servants. Woolf remembers this well. She says, here then 17 or 18 people lived in small bedrooms with 1 bathroom and 3 water closets between them. Here the 4 of us were born. Here my grandmother died. Here my mother died. Here my father died. She describes this childhood home as a space like a mausoleum, a sphere of death. And every room is filled with the possessions of the dead. She describes old letters that fill dozens of black boxes, old china that belong to people who no longer exist. And this notion of a closed, closely observed space is suggested again and again in her recollections of the decor, which is overwhelmingly dark. The wood is painted black, the furnishings are in red velvet. Another reason the house is dark, she writes, is because the street was so narrow that one could see Mrs. Redgrave washing her neck in the bedroom across the way. Also because my mother, who had been brought up in the Watts Venetian Little Holland House tradition, had covered the furniture in red velvet and painted the woodwork black with thin gold lines upon it. Her sister, Vanessa, recalls in her recollections of Hyde Park Gate that there was no electric light either, not until the very end. Vanessa says many of the rooms were pitch dark. Virginian creeper hung down in a thick curtain over the back drawing room window. The kitchen and other basement rooms could only be seen by a candle or lamplight, and most of the paint was black. Not until quite a short time before my father's death did we have electric light, and then not even everywhere. So we get from the sense of Bell's description and Woolf's as well, of a house that's outmoded, it's almost medieval in its darkness, its deeply cloistered space. And Virginia did not remember it fondly. She remembers it as being quite a traumatic environment. She says, when I look back upon that house, it seems to me so crowded with scenes of family life, grotesque, comic and tragic, with the violent explosions of emotions of youth, revolt, despair, intoxicating happiness, immense boredom, with parties of the famous and dull, with passionate affection for my father, alternating with passionate hatred of him, all tingling and vibrating in an atmosphere of youthful bewilderment and curiosity that I feel suffocated by the recollection. The place seemed tangled and matted with emotion. I could write the history of every mark and scratch in my room. The presence of her father really added to this claustrophobia. After the death of his wife, when Woolf was only 14, he became increasingly difficult to live with. He was demanding, domineering, tyrannical. And Woolf remembers the house as being like a cage where he prowled like a morose lion. Woolf's first breakdown in 1895 was, she later felt, the result of all the emotions and complications that existed inside the house. Got this lovely image here of Woolf with her parents. This is Woolf as a young girl. She's looking at both of them in the background with her hand under her chin. I really like this because you can sort of see her, dwelling on her parents, watching them quizzically. Even when Virginia and Vanessa were able to leave the house, it was to go to tedious parties where the shadow of history, the presence of their parents, still loomed. Woolf describes one such party in her memoirs, where she was dragged to a gathering held by the pre-Raphaelite painter Holman Hunt. Some of you may be familiar with the arts and crafts movement and the pre-Raphaelite movement. I've got some examples here of William Morris wallpaper in the top left, pre-Raphaelite motifs at the bottom here, a painting by Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And in the top right corner is a painting by Holman Hunt. The woman in the white dress in the center of that image is Woolf's mother. She's the model for that painting. Woolf remembers looking round the room at the party and seeing the families of several other artists, including that of William Morris, Edward Burne-Jones. She also remembers seeing a number of other fashionable people. She mentions the Lushingtons, the Stillmans, the Montgomerys. She's invoking all these old families that her parents used to know. The guests at this party were the same people that her mother used to socialize with when she was the same age, in her early 20s. They were old family friends, old being the operative word, and they were representative of artistic movements, the arts and crafts and pre-Raphaelite movements, that by the early 20th century were beginning to look stale and unfashionable. The death of Woolf's father offered the opportunity to begin afresh. When Vanessa moves everything out of the house from Hyde Park Gate, everything that they can take with them, Woolf remembers her as kind of dismantling this family home. She writes, she had sold, she had burnt, she had sorted, she had torn up. Sometimes I believe she actually had to get men with hammers to batter down, so wedged into one another had the walls and cabinets become. So the move to Bloomsbury is kind of described as a destroying or erasing of this previous building, this Victorian existence at Hyde Park Gate. Woolf actually says that when they chose the area of Bloomsbury, they simply looked at a map and seeing how far apart the areas of Bloomsbury and Kensington were, they decided that they should move to Bloomsbury. It was far enough away from home. I've done a black line on the map in front of you here, showing the move from the corner of Hyde Park all the way up to Bloomsbury. It's not a very big move. In reality, you can get a bus from one to the other in about 30 minutes these days if the traffic is good, but to them it feels monumentous, absolutely incredible. Now for Woolf, the change presented by Bloomsbury is not initially moral or philosophical, it was inherently domestic. To begin with, she writes, it was astonishing to stand at the drawing room window and to look into all those trees. The tree which shoots its branches up into the air and lets them fall in a shower. The tree which glistens after rain like the body of a seal. Instead of looking at old Mrs. Redgrave washing her neck across the way. So living in squares meant that the rooms looked out on trees and light. Woolf writes that the light and the air after the rich red gloom of Hyde Park were a revelation. And it's still a very pleasant way to live if you can afford to live in Bloomsbury. If any of you visited the space, you'll see that the topography of it, the geography of it, is kind of done in a grid almost, with all these houses facing a central garden area. At Gordon Square, Virginia and Vanessa each had a sitting room to themselves, and they could do completely as they pleased in terms of decorating and dressing. So the space was a canvas instead of a cage. Woolf writes, we were full of experiments and reforms. We were going to do without table napkins. We were going to have large supplies of bromo instead. It's kitchen roll. We were going to paint, to write, to have coffee after dinner instead of tea at 9 o'clock. Everything was going to be new. Everything was going to be different. Everything was on trial. So when I talk about living dangerously, I mean, we do have to keep in mind, these are upper middle class young ladies. They're not wealthy at this point, but they're doing all right. They're not doing anything that radical. You know, they've decided to go without table napkins and they're not going to dress before dinner. Dresses in, you know, put on a whole new set of clothes. They're going to paint, to write, and so on. To us, that may seem quite small. But to them, it's very exciting. These little shifts, these little tremors, seismic tremors, if you like, underneath the fabric of everyday life, are really what's causing a kind of internal change, a sense that anything is possible, everything is on trial. We can see her then dismantling the version of domesticity that existed in her father's house and replacing it with a modern experimental mode. We can see this from the decor at Gordon Square, which is entirely different to that at Hyde Park Gate. The drawing room at 46 Gordon Square still exists today. I sometimes take my students there. It's now called the Keynes Library because after Woolf and her brothers and sister moved out, Maynard Keynes moved in. It's owned by Birkbeck University and they've sort of painted it and put it together so that it looks similar to the way that it would have looked in the early 1900s. They even have some very expensive paintings on the wall painted by Vanessa Bell. It's a really fantastic space. Needless to say, the Watts Venetian tradition of red plush and black paint had been reversed. We'd entered the Sergeant Furse era, White and green chintzes were everywhere, and instead of Morris papers with intricate patterns, we decorated our walls with plain distemper. So again, she's sticking up a middle finger to the pre-Raphaelites and the arts and crafts people, William Morris, his fiddly diddly wallpapers, saying, no, we're going to paint walls with plain paint, which is what most of us do today. We don't think anything of it, but in this period to just paint and keep it plain was a new mode of design. And it's interesting that interior design becomes a huge part of the Bloomsbury Group's output and their philosophy and how they disseminate their ideas to the wider world. Duncan Grant and Roger Fry and Vanessa Bell found the Omega workshops in Bloomsbury. It runs from 1913 to 1914. In it, they sell furniture, mostly, some clothing, some wallpaper, all of it done themselves. And it's, you know, you can see examples here in front of you. It's very bold, very creative. Got an example here of an entire room done up in the Omega style. Another member or sort of fringe member of the group, Wyndham Lewis, sets up a Rebel Arts Centre, that's what he calls it, the Rebel Arts Centre, in the area as well. And in that he sells artworks, avant-garde artworks, and he also undertook interior design commissions. So this was something that was quite broad. It's kind of occurring in different places. So these were short-lived projects, but they do show how earnest many members were about the links between furnishing a home and creating a community or culture. They understood that space informs behaviour and can encourage or discourage certain ways of living. But if they were to do this properly, they needed to address their behaviour, their conversation, how they acted in the home, as well as their surroundings. To design a new space in which to live was one thing, but you also have to design new ways of being, new ways of interacting too. The old rituals of the 19th century drawing room had to be replaced with something more feasible, something more freeing. And we can see the evolution of these new behaviours in Woolf's description of the first Thursday evening party. This is again part of her memoirs that I keep referring to. She writes, these astonishing fellows came in. This is Lytton Strachey and Saxon Turner and all the rest. Vanessa and I were in a twitter of excitement. It was late at night. The room was full of smoke. Buns, coffee and whiskey were strewn about. We were not wearing white satin or seed pearls. They came in hesitatingly, self-effacingly, and the conversation, as it goes on, is quite stilted. People aren't sure what to say to one another. Then at last, Virginia writes, Vanessa, having said perhaps that she'd been to some picture show, incautiously used the word beauty. It was as if the bull had at last been turned into the ring. The bull might be beauty, it might be good, it might be reality, whatever it was some abstract question that now drew out all our forces. Woolf's account is of a drawing room becoming a college room. It becomes an educational space for free thinking. Duncan Grant describes these meetings when he joined the group after they moved to Fitzroy Square around the corner. He remembers roughly the shape of what happened on these meetings. About 10 o'clock in the evening, people used to appear and continue to come at intervals till 12 o'clock at night. And it was seldom that the last guest left before 2 or 3 in the morning. Whiskey, buns and cocoa were the diet, and people talked to each other. If someone had lit a pipe, he would sometimes hold out the lighted match to Hans the dog, who would snap at it and put it out. Conversation, that was all. Yet many people made a habit of coming, and few who did so will forget those evenings. For Woolf, the main benefit of these Thursday evening gatherings was the atmosphere of equality as well as that of intellectual vigor. She said part of the charm of those Thursday evenings was that they were astonishingly abstract. It was not only that Moore, G.E. Moore's book, had set us all discussing philosophy, art, religion. It was the atmosphere that was abstract in the extreme. The young men had no manners in the Hyde Park Gate sense. They criticised our arguments as severely as their own. They never seemed to notice how we were dressed or if we were looking nice or not. Another addition to the conversation was the theme of sex. Woolf remembers that at Gordon Square, love was never mentioned. They had this period where they didn't really talk about sex very much. And then quite suddenly, one day, Lytton Strachey comes into the drawing room and sees a stain on Vanessa's dress. He points at it and he says one word, semen? And everyone pauses and they think, can we say it? Can we say the word semen? Yes, they can. And they continue then to talk about sex, not strictly reproductive sex either, gay sex, sex for pleasure, extramarital sex, and so on. So sex is a part of this new domestic arrangement, but not in the same way as it was in the Victorian family home, where it played this, reproductive role. Nonetheless, marriage, conventional marriage and non-conventional relationships did play a role in the Bloomsbury Group. Now, I think we can say these are not the kind of relationships known to or approved of by the 19th century generation. So as I've mentioned before, Clive Bell married Vanessa, Leonard Woolf married Virginia, Duncan Grant had a daughter with Vanessa. That daughter then grew up to marry one of Grant's lovers, Duncan Garnet. Numerous sexual relationships can be traced between members, and many include Duncan Grant. Maynard Keynes, Adrian Stephen, Lytton Strachey, and Vanessa all had relationships with him. And this helps further the waggish definition of the Bloomsbury set as a group of men and women who were all in love with Duncan Grant. So let's do a final comparison here as we kind of wrap up towards the end. Just comparing that Victorian existence with the new world of Hyde Park Gate. There's no strict gender barrier in this new space. There's also no thought of marriage initially. Woolf is free from being judged based on her sex. And she's actually freed often of being a sex object because most of the men around her are gay, not very interested in her, sexually at all. There are late parties that go on all hours. There's no strict kind of pouring out tea ritual. Instead, it's just buns and cocoa, kind of college student food. People have freedom of the house. There's the freedom afforded by these big rooms. There's space to do your work. You have a room of one's own, a territory to stake out for yourself. There's space to think. There's space to write. When I talk about Bloomsbury living dangerously, this is partly what I mean. They are flying in the face of their parents' generation through their domestic choices. And these experiments that they make embolden them to embark on some of their best work. There's simply no way that Woolf would become the writer she became without Gordon Square. She freely admits that if her father had continued living, he would have been the death of her. So it's within the communities fostered by the Thursday evening parties that men like Lytton Strachey and Duncan Grant are able to live with some degree of freedom, despite the laws that would see them put in prison. It's in these spaces that Leonard Woolf and Clive Bell can have discussions that fiercely attack the British Empire and that question the point of war, in particular World War I. And it was partly due to the war that Bloomsbury ended up moving away from that kind of central London location and started to spread into the home counties and create little satellites. You have Charleston, which is set up by Vanessa Bell to accommodate her family, Clive Bell, her two sons at this point, and Duncan Grant, the soon-to-be lover, and Roger Fry as well. She rents the house in 1916 and remains there for the rest of her life. So this is a multi-family situation. Clive Bell moves out. He decides to go have an affair with a lady called Mary Hutchinson. Vanessa ends up having an affair with Duncan Grant. It's not your classic family setup. There's also a kind of a lovely sense that all of the people living in the house contribute to its architecture, or at least the way that it's decorated. All of the walls, every surface, it seems, is painted. You can see the work of Duncan Grant and Vanessa Bell in every room. Roger Fry was responsible for laying out the gardens at Charleston. This is a painting of the pond at Charleston done by Duncan Grant. And these are the gardens. Roger Fry himself had a garden landscaped by the famous female landscape designer Gertrude Jekyll, and you can see some influences of her work on this space. And another example of a lovely Bloomsbury satellite happening, sorry, this is the honey they produce, because they had to be working on the land, they had to be doing agricultural work in order to justify not being sent to the front. So Duncan Grant, David Garnett start to raise bees, they work on the land and subsist in that manner. Another Bloomsbury satellite was Garsington Manor in Oxfordshire, which was home to the formidable Lady Ottilie Murrell between 1915 and 1928. My word, the things I could tell you about this lady. I won't go into them, we haven't got time, but I suggest you look her up. She is magnificent. Supposedly, she is the inspiration behind D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley. She has an affair with a gardener. This is Garsington Manor as it looked at the time. I went there a few years ago. Here are some of the people who visited W.B. Yeats in the centre there. Went there a few years ago, it looks exactly the same. A lady now owns it. She bought it for £5 million, and I think she got one hell of a bargain. Some paintings here of the scene. Garsington is just one example of the many clubs or communities fostered by this extraordinary set of people. In the past 50 minutes or so, I've listed more societies than I can easily count, running from the Midnight Society through to the Apostles, the Omega Workshops and beyond. We have Gordon Square, Thursday evenings, Charleston, Garsington, and so on. Well into the 1920s and 30s and 40s, they were creating new networks. One of the very last of these efforts was the Memoir Club. This was a group of Bloomsbury Group members who met once a month and read from their memoirs. Many of these reminiscences were meant to reflect on the forming of Bloomsbury. And in fact, the memoir of Wolfe's that I've been using throughout this talk was actually written specifically for the Memoir Club to be read at one of these events. The work of the Memoir Club was an extraordinary effort of self-narration or self-actualization. By having members recount their memories to one another, some of which are about one another, it results in cementing the legacy of the group itself. And this is partly, I think, why our conception of them is so strong, despite the fact we might struggle with definitions or figuring out who belongs in and who belongs out. I think the reason we still have this lasting impression of the group is because it was perpetuated by the group itself. In fact, the Bloomsbury Group can be best defined as a group of people who were fascinated by and interested in sustaining the phenomenon known as the Bloomsbury Group. Their conception of living dangerously ranged from fairly mild protests, such as painting furniture, to flagrant disobedience of the law. While their attempts at modern living could be haphazard, even ill-fated at times, they did succeed in carving out lifestyles that nurtured rather than stifled intellectual freedoms. This connection between living and learning is one of their greatest legacies, and it's one that's pertinent as we consider the study abroad programme and the culture of the modern university more generally. Thinking about the Bloomsbury Group might lead us to ask, what environments best encourage academic curiosity? How does a geographical move affect intellectual and personal development? Can the university be an alternative space to the family home, one with different expectations and opportunities? To what degree does having a new space allow a person to carve out their own psychological, intellectual, or even political space? I'd like to end on a quote here from Virginia Woolf's work, 3 Guineas, where she's writing to an imaginary correspondent, and she's explaining at one point how a college for women should be built. And the advice that she gives could easily double as a descriptor for Bloomsbury life, as much as it is a descriptor of good university life. She writes, "Let it be built on lines of its own. It must be built not of carved stone and stained glass, but of some cheap, easily combustible material which does not hoard dust and perpetuate traditions. Do not have chapels. Do not have museums and libraries with chained books and first editions under glass cases. Let the pictures be new and always changing. Let it be decorated afresh by each generation, by their own hands, cheaply." And with that, I shall draw to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful, wonderful lecture. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone here did as well. Thank you for that wonderful lecture. We do want to answer some questions that you all have, if there are any questions. So you can feel free to type those in the chat if you do have any. But before that, I'm going to just share my screen really quickly and go over some ways that you can stay involved and connected with international programs. So the first way that you can stay connected to us is just by sharing your photos and videos and memories with us. So if you studied abroad in London or somewhere else, we would love to get your memories and photos, and you can send those to ip-media@fsu.edu. The next way you can stay involved is by joining the FSU IP London Alumni Facebook group. So if you're not part of that yet, we post lots of great things in there. It's really a wonderful opportunity to connect with other alumni. And then the third way to stay connected with international programs is to give back to the cause of international education. And you can do that by donating during the FSU Great Give, which is next Wednesday, March 9th. And that's going to be a day where we're raising funds for our student scholarships and also our fund to support our study centers abroad as well. So those are a couple ways that you can give back to international programs. And then also we do want to remind you that the London 50th anniversary celebration is still going on. We have one more event coming up on April 12th, and that is FSU London Back to the Future. So if you are interested in that, please be sure to sign up. We can put a link in the chat for that as well. So I will stop sharing my screen here and see if we have any questions in the chat. Everyone's saying how wonderful the lecture was. Wonderful.
Anything was unclear, you can ask me to clarify. I did have to jump over a few things. So we may have.
I have one question. Was Wyndham Lewis homosexual as well?
No, he was kind of aggressively straight, was old Wyndham Lewis. I mean, you might think, I don't know, maybe he's trying to sort of disprove something, but he had long-term relationships with some very unfortunate women. Unfortunate in the sense that they had to be in a relationship with Wyndham Lewis. He was an unusual character, had sympathies with fascism, quite aggressive generally as a person, liked to pick fights, but nonetheless was so interesting as an individual. He creates, kind of spearheads vorticism in Britain and creates this incredible magazine called Blast that he publishes in 1914. It only goes into 2 issues, but it's just mind-bending how modern and bold he is as an artist and writer. In a way, much more so than his contemporaries at the time. He's almost postmodern at times. But sorry, to answer the question, to my knowledge, he was not homosexual.
Interesting. We have another question here. Was the Hyde Park house typical of the day?
Typical of upper class Victorian life, yes. I suppose the personal circumstances were unique. You know, not everybody had an overbearing father who was tyrannical the way Leslie Stephen was, and certainly not everybody had such famous relatives. You know, her family knew the Darwins. You know, they had links with the Tennysons. It's remarkable the kind of literary lineage that they had access to, and I think that maybe increased Woolf's sense of living in the past, living deeply entrenched in history. However, the kind of day-to-day existence, you wake up in the morning, you dress, you have a limited amount of time as a woman to yourself, reading and so on. You accept guests for a set period. There are rituals of the tea room that you observe. You pour the tea, everything has a certain rhythm. There are certain conversation topics that you stick to. And then there's, you know, socializing and tedious events on top of that. In that sense, yes, it is very typical of what women of her class would have been exposed to.
We do have a couple more questions. I know we're nearing the end of the hour, so if you have to log off, that's fine, but we'll try to answer a couple more. One is that logistical question, will the recording be available of this lecture, and where will it be available? And yes, we will put this recording on the International Programs YouTube page, and we'll send it out to everyone who signed up for this lecture as well. We have a question here. Can you remind us the name of the woman who helped inspire D.H. Lawrence? You mentioned we should look into her because she was fascinating.
Yes, Lady Ottoline Morrell, spelt sort of moral, Morrell. Yes, she was amazing. She was this sort of an aristocrat with French aristocratic connections. She always wore this long string of pearls that she believed belonged to Marie Antoinette, and she was generous to a fault. I mean, she really supported a number of key modernist writers. She wasn't much of a writer herself, but she made sure that people like Katherine Mansfield had enough to eat. She looked after Bertrand Russell, D.H. Lawrence, gave them shelter in her house. They all had rooms and kind of, you know, of their own that they could come and go as they pleased into. And she did all this, you know, her husband was an MP. He also tirelessly worked to make sure that a lot of these young men, Bloomsbury men, weren't drafted. They had an open marriage. And yeah, she fell in love with her gardener at Garsington. He was 18 at the time. And he died 1 year later in her arms, rather dramatically. He had heart failure and collapsed. And supposedly that partly fed into the plot behind Lady Chatterley's Lover, where she falls in love with the groundskeeper.
Interesting. It looks like we have one more question if you have time. It says, Virginia Woolf seems to be the most well-known member of the Bloomsbury Group, at least outside of academics. Is there any indication that she received more attention than the other members in her time? Or perhaps was there any indication of jealousy within the group?
First part of the question, yes, she does receive a lot of attention. I think at the time she received a fair amount. Even then she was considered to sort of be at the centre of Bloomsbury. When we're thinking about key members of the group, she always comes up. Her father as well, Leslie Stephen, is sort of considered the father of Bloomsbury. You know, his work and his ideas are kind of percolating in the background too. In terms of, you know, is it justified? I think it is justified, but partly she has such a great deal to do with kind of presenting the group to the wider world through her memoirs and diaries and so on, that we just end up sort of seeing it through her perspective more often than not. The question of jealousy, they weren't jealous in the sense that they were overly conscious of themselves as a Bloomsbury group. They were not. They understood that was how other people saw them. They didn't get too bogged down in this notion of themselves as being that. It wasn't like, you know, launching a band and worrying about who's the lead singer. However, there was general jealousy about success that ran throughout these friendships. A lot of admiration that they had for one another, but then often bitterness, sometimes connected with one another's successes.
It looks like we have a couple more questions. The first is, Gertrude Stein was in England in 1914 with Alice Toklas. She knew Adeline and Wyndham Lewis. What was her relationship with the Bloomsbury Group? Do we know if she knew them?
Oh yeah, she knows them and she works with them, but she has an interesting relationship because she moves to Paris and she gets really, you know, in the center of kind of Parisian literary life. Doesn't mean she's detached from the work going on in London, but geographically she is then later removed. She's more involved, you know, with people like James Joyce, again, this character he does have some relationship with the Bloomsbury Group, and the group are reading his work, really fascinated by Ulysses, but he's not in the same geographical space. He's not going to the same parties. Gertrude Stein, you know, is going to some of the parties, she's kind of around, and then she goes off and does her own thing and is really a powerhouse unto her own. I don't know that she would have made as much of an impact if she'd stayed in Bloomsbury, because there are so many personalities there. And she was really, you know, a manager of people amongst other things. And I think it was better for her to kind of go and do that. Also in a country where the presentation of her gender and her relationship with a woman could be done more openly.
Interesting. The next question we have is, what involvement, if any, was there with the fight for the vote for women?
There's an overlap a little bit. Lytton Strachey's mother was a keen member of the suffrage movement, huge advocate for that movement. Virginia Woolf helps the suffrage cause a little bit. She spends some time labeling and stamping envelopes for them. She finds quite tedious. So generally speaking, they support it, but actually Woolf does write in A Room of One's Own. She says, you know, I don't think the vote is going to do much for us. It's not really about the vote. It's not having this kind of legal political agency. She's more concerned with cultural change and social change. You know, giving women the material needs, that material feminism, money, space. You know, what are we going to do with the ballots? It's all well and good. She's actually very pessimistic about kind of exercising your, you know, your will within a democracy that is ultimately run by men. You know, she says this isn't going to work, is it? That we don't have representatives in government. That, you know, as a woman, I have no country. My country is the whole world, she writes at one point. She doesn't kind of pledge fealty to a state. But generally, yes, the group are progressive and they believe in gender equality as a rule.
We'll take one more question here. Gertrude Stein never mentions Joyce in her biography. Is that one of the big gaps? Do you think she was jealous?
I don't know. I don't know. Sometimes subjects are so vast and difficult to pin down that maybe they're best to avoid. And Joyce is a difficult subject. You know, his biographers struggle. His output is hard enough. You know, if you've ever read Ulysses, you'll know what I mean. I don't know that it came from jealousy necessarily. She did support him in some pretty vital ways. But yes, no, it is curious. There are a lot of gaps. I mean, we're left with the fragments really of history here that we have to work with, and we do our best with the leasings, if you like, of time. So, you know, we can make judgments based on that. We can't draw firm conclusions all the time.
Of course. Well, I think that's the end of our questions. We want to say thank you so much again. There's many, many comments here in the chat about how wonderful the lecture was. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.